This is Randall Root, and in this video we'll be taking a look at how to create an SSAS date dimension. In the previous video, we looked at creating a simple stores dimension based off the dim stores table. Here, we're going to go ahead and create a dimension, a dim dates dimension based on the dim dates table. We start by going to the wizard and launching it just like we did previously. We use an existing table and go forward. Choosing dim dates, we identify the date key and the date name. When you made your underlying table, if you chose to create your column names, such as date key and date name, it just makes life easier on the SSAS developer. But be aware that it's not the name that's important, it's the content. So the people designing the data warehouse may have called it many different things. You really have to know what's underneath. For example, if I right click and I say explore the data, I can see here that the date key is an artificial identifier. The date is the actual numeric representation of the date versus the date name, which is a human-friendly representation of the date name. Other columns follow the same pattern. So, when I launch the wizard, I choose the key column for date key, the name column for date name, because I know what those columns contain. When I advance the wizard again, I would go ahead and choose to include like the numeric date, the month, but not the month name. And the reason for that is I'm going to use the month name column as the name the column month name as the name column of the attribute month. Boy, that sounds like a confusing sentence. But just like we had the date key has a date name, we're going to use month name for month, and quarter name for quarter, and year name for year. In most dimensions, leaving the attribute type as regular is perfectly fine, but not date dimensions. The reason for this is when you're doing MDX coding, there's a number of date functions that only work if the dimension is identified as being a date type dimension, or the attribute is identified as being a date type attribute. So it's important with these date dimensions to go through and set the attribute type. They even have a special category for it. In this case, working with just calendar date. Now, unfortunately, Microsoft did not put a lot of polish into these choices. For example, you'll see date in two places. In general, the first date is just the human-friendly numeric representation. The second date is designed for human-friendly text representation. The second date seems to be designed for the numeric representation, but there's no real guidance on any of their website or documentations that indicate that. At least none that I found over the last several years. We get a little easier on the month one. There's just a single choice. Same is true of quarter. And the same is true of year. Oops. Can't see the OK button, but it's here. And then I usually take out the space in the name, and we're done with that part. Now it's just doing some adjustment. I would encourage you at this point to go ahead and try to process. Once again, I'll go through the various different steps, including saving your file, building the master file, going through and uploading the master file to the server. That's the deployment piece. And then processing is where you copy the data from the data warehouse or data source using select statements. Now that the data has been brought over, we can go ahead and go to the browser and take a look at the different settings, such date. There's the numeric representation versus date key. There's the human-friendly human representation, or text representation. Month. Currently we don't have a name column defined for it, so we see identifiers. Same is true of quarter and year. Now year, the numeric representation is actually the same, at least in most cases, as what would be presented. But we should probably go ahead and configure this one as well. -2 and -1 are very descriptive. So let's start off with the date column. The date column, its key column is dim dates. Its name column is unidentified, so it will default to dim dates. But to tell you the truth, or dim dates, I'm so sorry, the date column, I usually go ahead and explicitly set it. And the type is fine. It's interesting. In the type, from the wizard to the property sheet, you'll see that the identification of the categories are different. The naming is different. Apparently, the person that actually put the list together for the property sheet either didn't look at the wizard or vice versa, or maybe they just had a difference of opinion. It doesn't really matter. It still represents the same thing. Now, the date key, I think I'll change the name to full date. I think it's more descriptive. Name column is date name, the key column is date key. So anyway, month will go to, let's change month so that the name column is month name. So now the key column is month, the name column is month name, the attribute name is month as well, and the type is, well, months. Quarter, name column gets changed to quarter name. And year, name column gets changed to year name. In order to see our changes, we need to process. There's also a button over here, the second button on the toolbar, that will also start the processing. It's the same thing. Okay, now that it's processed, we can go to the browser tab, but it doesn't show our changes. Now this is common. There is a reconnect button. It's the second button here, but there's also a refresh button. Now, the thing is that in general, the one that you want to use is the reconnect. It seems to be more effective. Now we can see that instead of just seeing -1, -2, we can see it says corrupt year or unknown year. These represent values perhaps in the data warehouse that were suspect. Plus, the name column gives us more descriptive quarter information, month names, the full date, and finally the dates. In general, it's recommended that when you have more than a few attributes, that you form a custom hierarchy. You can do so by dragging over an attribute to the hierarchy screen. You start with the highest level of the hierarchy. In other words, if a hierarchy were to be thought as forming a pyramid, the top level would be year, then quarter, then month, then date or full date, depending on your choice. So the various different levels are identified, and you always start with the top. So I drag year over, then quarter, then month, and then finally either date or full date. A warning glyph comes up saying attribute relationships do not exist. Now this occasionally will be configured for you, so you will not always see this, but it says it may result in decreased query performance. So while it may still work, it should be adjusted, and we'll do that in just a minute. Another thing we should do is probably give it a better name. So I'm going to go ahead and define it as the date hierarchy. And since my naming convention is normally to not have any spaces, perhaps I'll go ahead and just take those spaces out as well. Now, the warning that we're getting has to do with the attribute relationships on the second tab here, attribute relationship tab. And what we need to do is redefine these. Currently, the relationships all stem from full date, but really what we want is we want the year, quarter, month to actually be presented in a chain. I'll show you what I mean here in just a second. The easiest way to accomplish this is break the current relationships by going down here and highlighting all of them by left clicking and dragging, and then just say delete. Now this will not delete your attributes, it just deletes the relationships. Then, starting from the key column, full date, right click and say that you would like to make a new attribute relationship and point to the attribute you want it to connect. If you believe that a change could happen in the future, you can set the relationship to be flexible. If you believe that things should never change long term, and if it does, you'd like to get an error message when somebody tries to process your cube, you can set it to rigid. The change doesn't the setting doesn't matter too much. It really configures when you're going to get an error or not. You will get better performance if you set things to rigid, because the algorithm that compares what it used to be to what it currently is when you do the processing, in other words, it senses the change. It will run if it's flexible to see if things have changed. If it's rigid, it'll not need to run that algorithm and will provide you with a small improvement in processing performance. Since date is not associated with a custom hierarchy, it assumes that it has a sibling relationship instead of a parent-child relationship. When we do the same thing again, we say full date, new relationship, and we point to something like month, it recognizes that that's a parent-child relationship. In other words, a month is the parent of a given date. From there, we do the same thing from month to quarter. Or from quarter to year. I'm going to leave it as flexible here so we can see how we can change it later. The icons here, dark indicates that it's rigid, light indicates that it's flexible. If you want to change the relationship type, you can. If you're concerned about it, don't worry about it too much. It will always work. It's just a matter of it may take a little longer to process if the setting isn't correct. Or you may not see errors if the underlying database makes changes that you would like to be notified about. In general, it's probably good to just go ahead and set it to rigid. If you think that changes will not occur, I don't think the month of January is going to go under a different quarter anytime soon, so I'd set it to rigid. Or if you think something might change, such as a customer's address or phone number, you would keep that relationship flexible. A better description might be, example might be a product's category. So if a product would be associated with a given category, a different category at a later point in time, that would be flexible. Once we go back to the dimension structure tab, we can see that the little warning symbol is gone now. At this point, it's probably a good time to go ahead and do the process again. This time, just to show this how the button works, I'll go ahead and press that. And process the dimension. Uh-oh, it says there is an issue. There's a duplicate key found when doing the processing on the quarter value. Now, this is pretty common. It's easy to resolve, but let me talk about the issue. If I right click and take a look at the underlying data in the data source view, and you can do that either from the data source view or from here, you'll see that the key columns are identified with 1, 2, 3, etc. Well, the problem is that this is 1990 in the pub database, but if I go down to 1991 and look at the first quarter, it's also 1. When things weren't grouped into a hierarchy, it couldn't get confused about the fact that the first quarter shows up under a different parent. But now that quarters are grouped by a particular parent year, it's confused about where things should go. In other words, it sees a duplicate key value, which is the error message that we just saw. So, to resolve it, we need some way of identifying that a given quarter is associated with a given year. And we can do that by changing the key value of the quarter to a composite. You'll notice that it says key columns. But what we do is we just indicate more than one column. By clicking on the key columns property menu choice and choosing the magic ellipsis button that appears, and then going through and saying group the quarters by year, put the year at the top, so year first, then quarters. Now we can uniquely identify one quarter from another. This time the issue is on the month. It's the same issue though. You need to identify unique month values, so I'll do the same thing. Key columns, and add in the year and the quarter. Year, quarter, month. The dates are uniquely identified, so that's not a problem. By the way, if we had designed our data warehouse differently, in which case the month was not only associated with just a single digit value, but also some other indications such as maybe the combination of the month, the quarter, or the year, or even just the month and the year, anything that would make it unique, we wouldn't have this issue. In fact, in most data warehouses, I would recommend you go ahead and put a fully identifiable key. So there's some discussion about this, but once again, this is a data warehouse design issue. If you're just doing the cube part, you may not have any control over how the data warehouse is designed, nor do you have any way of changing it. So you just have to be aware of this issue so you can get around it. Okay, so we've configured the month and the quarter to be uniquely identifiable. As I had said, the dates are uniquely identifiable. There's no ambiguity between them, either in the date column, the date name. Actually, it's the key columns that are important. The key column or the date column. So we're good to go. This time it should process just fine. Now we can go to the browser tab and see what we've done. Notice that the date's still there. The full date's still there. The month and the quarter. But I don't see my date hierarchy. And that's once again because I need to reconnect. There it is. And now I can actually drill down through the year to the quarter to the month to the individual dates. Later, when we go to build a cube, we'll be able to browse the cube measures and the stores and the dates using that either the individual attributes or the custom hierarchies. We'll see that in a later video. But for now, hopefully you've got a better understanding of how to create a date dimension from an existing source. Thanks for watching.